Hello, everyone, and welcome to the DBMI seminar series for the fall semester. We know it's been a tough summer and hope we're finding everyone in relatively good health. Definitely feels different to do it virtually, but we hope the lineup of speakers for the fall will serve everyone's interests. And to kick off the semester, we have a wonderful member of our own department, Dr. Vimla Patel. She's a senior research scientist and director of the Center for Cognitive Studies in Medicine and Public Health at the New York Academy of Medicine. She's also an adjunct professor of biomedical informatics at Columbia and of health and policy and research at Weill Cornell College of Medicine. An education and college psychology PhD graduate of McGill University in Montreal. She was a professor of medicine and the director of McGill's Cognitive Science Center. Her early research focused on the scientific foundations for medical education, focusing on medical decision-making and expert reasoning. She subsequently served as professor of biomedical informatics at Columbia, Arizona State University, and the University of Texas Health Sciences Center in Houston. She's also an associate editor of the Journal of Biomedical Informatics and on the editorial board of Intelligence-Based Medicine. She's an editor of the Springer book series on cognitive informatics in biomedical medicine and healthcare. And her current research deals with the impact of technology on human cognition for safer and effective clinical practice, as well as on global mental health. She has over 300 scholarly publications spanning books and journals in biomedical informatics, education, clinical medicine, and cognitive science. Today, she'll be talking to us about medical expertise, why and when is explanation needed. And as is the norm, we'll do like a 50-minute talk and leave about 10 minutes for Q&A. You can use like the raise hands feature in Zoom at the end when we do Q&A. So with that, I'll hand it off over to Vimla.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to open the fall series at the DBMI with the first seminar. It's been, I was there 7 years as a full-time from 2000 to 2007. And so now returning as an adjunct faculty, I've been for a long time now. It's been really a great pleasure to walk down some of the memory lanes of the earlier research that was done that has a great bearing on the current work we are doing in work in decision support and artificial intelligence, and still consider some of that work to be very important. So I was trying to pull together some of the earlier work that I did. At that time, nobody was doing that, and it was against the mainstream to do very much of a kinds of work that I did in a symbolic tradition and bring it to bear to the current. And that's what my talk is going to be about. Okay, with that, let me share this screen with you to go over. Okay. So I'm going to, let me just stop share and share again. Okay. Where did I go? All right. Share screen.
Yeah. She had it right.
Come
on. Yeah.
All right.
And then you got to hit the.
There we go. Okay, got it. Thank you. Oh, technologically challenged. So the talk is, as you heard, is about medical expertise and why and when explanation is needed. We are very much concerned about explanations these days, particularly related to the artificial intelligence systems. So what do we know about expertise? When we talk about, oh, he's an expert or she's an expert in something. So there are very generic few things about experts who are considered experts. You know, you're looking for an expert doctor, an expert person, an expert nurse in intensive care unit. So there's a lot of work written in this area. So one of the things is experts excel in their own domain of expertise. The moment you put that expert outside the domain of expertise, they don't do so well. So it's very specific to the domain. And experts perceive large, meaningful patterns. When you say they can see, they don't see individual units, they see a pattern. In the verbal domain, when you don't see a pattern, it's called a chunk, clusters of information together that recognizes a disease or recognizes something important. Experts represent problem at a much deeper level. And you might find someone who's not an expert, just a novice, solve the problem the same way as an expert might. But if you probe a little deeper, expert will have much better knowledge, underlying structure, but the novice will not have. Experts spend time qualitatively analyzing a problem. The novices do is break the task into little pieces and then trial by trial and error. They'll try one, doesn't work, they'll try another thing, they'll try a third thing. So it's a very different nature of solving a problem as opposed to what an expert would do. An expert uses very specific reasoning strategies in solving problems because they have developed these strategies over time as they became an expert. Novices don't do that kind of thing. Experts have strong self-monitoring metacognitive skills. They're able to evaluate themselves to say, oh no, did I just say that? I don't think that's correct. That is a very important thing about recognizing a strategy when something's not working. Machines are not able to do that so well. So this is a familiarity for everyone. This is the top of an iceberg. So when you see an iceberg and that's all what you see, if you see this and make decisions and make recommendations for diagnosis or therapy or policy, you are missing a lot of things that are underneath it or beneath that. And it's the beneath part that makes a big difference because that will influence what should happen here, not what you see, but what is the underlying structure. That can be very deceptive. So my whole work on the domain of cognition, cognitive science, at that time when I was doing it was quite new. Not too many people were doing that kind of work. I was particularly interested in this part, understanding what's beneath what I saw up top. Being in the dimensions of medical education at that time, because I was the director of medical education at McGill University, part of the Faculty of Medicine. So I had to report to Dean every now and then to see what do we know about medical curriculum, why is our curriculum better or worse than any other ones. Everybody's moving towards problem-based learning. Should we be moving towards it? What evidence do we have? So what we saw wasn't enough. I had to go down here to find out. And that's the kind of research we did that made me understand a little bit much deeper understanding of what experts do. So this is if you consider a brain and how people think, brain cognition, and these are the cognitive processes that goes on in the brain, including logic, problem solving, reasoning. That includes perception, intelligence, creativity, memory, learning, language, all of which you recognize. We use it in one form or another. One of the important sciences that lends itself to this process here. And just to know, this is an invisible process. This is not available to you. Okay, so this is something we have to tap at. We have to get at that. This is called the black box, and as you hear so often when the airline crashes or there's some kind of disaster, they'll say, well, we think it's a human error, or we think it's a technical error, but we are not going to know until we get the black box. In medicine, we don't have that black box. So we have to elicit this information somehow, using some of the methodologies to elicit. And one of the areas that you borrows from is cognitive science. Cognitive science is a collective name for many sciences: linguistics, philosophy, neuroscience, computer science, cognitive psychology, as well as I would call it cognitive anthropology these days, are an important aspect to it. These sciences collectively form cognitive science. When I was working at McGill after my graduation, one of the departments or sections we had built within McGill was a Center for Cognitive Science, which I used to look after and be director of for a few years, so that if the students wanted to get a degree in cognitive science, they would have to major in one of these areas, say philosophy, linguistic, neuroscience, and then take courses in other ones. They have to have so many courses in other divisions. You cannot get a degree in cognitive science without doing that. And you have to major in one of these. So you ground in one of that. Now, how does this lend itself? These are all the areas that provide the theory and methods. And cognitive science, you can collectively use different methods depending on what kind of problems you bear. So why is cognitive science important, or cognition, or human thought is important? Basic science or basic research, it's basically, by the way, this is a plea for science. It's so important to understand science and not just work with technology. Cognitive science is one such science, and kinds of things we study in cognitive science, and it doesn't have to be medically related. Knowledge organization and human memory, how people remember things. What is the relationship between short-term and long-term memory? How do people solve problems? Develop certain kinds of rules of thumb, makes it easier, heuristics, reasoning strategies. How do I perceive my environment around me? How do I pay attention to anything? Diagrammatic reasoning, how do I perceive these diagrams or even a map of London Underground? Text comprehension, how do I understand what I read in newspapers? Dialogue analysis, distributed cognition. How do you coordinate theory and evidence? How do doctors do that? How do nurses do that? How do lay people do that in the public? What is a natural intelligence? What is the nature of intelligence we're talking about? Once we bring into the medical domain, we are talking about organization of clinical and basic science knowledge, including genomic these days, medical problem solving, decision making, interpretation of radiological and other visual data, perceptual processes of patient data displays, learning from medical text, collaboration, medical discourse analysis, collaborative practices in healthcare. Nobody works alone anytime, anyway. Diagnostic and therapeutic decision, and expertise in clinical practice. Now, what does all this have to do with developing safer and better systems for healthcare? And these have a direct bearing on development of medical AI systems or other kinds of support. For example, development use of medical terminologies, knowledge bases, intelligence systems, medical artificial intelligence, decision support systems, visual data analytics, machine learning, biomedical information visualization, natural language processing, technology-supported collaborative environment, and interactive environment with collaborative problem solving, or many such like. This is just a few examples I put together. So there is a relation. So science, the theories and frameworks in basic science keeps on developing. And people working in medical cognition, like myself, have to keep up with the basic science to update my work on medical cognition. If people say, no, that is not the relationship, this is not how you remember things, this is not how you understand things, and this is not how people perceive things, it's changed. I have to make sure I change my medical cognition framework. Otherwise, I'm going to be far behind and archaic. Science will keep on developing. When you are developing systems, if you don't keep up to date with these kinds of work in medical cognition, or at least collaborative relationship with them, this is not going to, you are going to be completely behind times and will not develop up-to-date systems that are usable. So 1978, when I had just joined McGill University as an undergrad, first year master's, as a graduate student, first year master's student. And there's a book that came out as Elstein, Schulman, Skravka, which was a very influential book because the first book that looked clinical reasoning was investigated by medical researchers and used psychological theories to develop that. And it was pretty powerful work. And there was other work that was going on by Jerome Cassira at Tufts University, Ben Kuipers, a computer scientist at MIT, and important simulation work by Tony Gorey, and the people at Tufts, and Bill Schwartz at Tufts as well. And these work were very influential in using medical cognition to develop. And this was very early. We're talking about 76, 78. I was quite influenced by that, saying, wow, this is really exciting. And I wanted to do more of this work. So I pursued a few years trying to understand it, what it was all about. And so now I'm going to walk down the memory lane and talk about how and what kind of work we did and why it is important today. Although we're talking about 80s, I'm going to talk about work in 80s. So today we're talking about relationship between this cognitive scientific work and artificial intelligence systems. So AI and cognitive psychology have paradigmatic approaches. They are two different processes work together, and they develop models so one way of looking at relationship between the two is to develop models that operate both as a psychological model, as an AI system as well. A good model was Sowa by Alan Newell in 1990 at Carnegie Mellon. That was a wonderful model that also influenced my work. Mario Stefanelli at University of Pavia in Italy also worked with such systems. And the second way to do it is to use ideas from one domain, whether it is AI to cognitive science or cognition to AI, to use ideas and techniques in one area and influence the resulting complementary evolution of ideas in another one. And this is the second one that I'm more concerned with today. So looking for synergies between the two. So goal is of cognitive psychology, where it was my primary domain, was interested in describing, explaining, and predicting human performance. And AI system developers develop high-performance system to facilitate complex tasks. The study of expert performance can illustrate cross-fertilization of ideas. Expert performance was related to both system developers as well as cognitive psychological trend. What do experts do? How do they perform in such a way that they do the best they can? Develop models of high performance, strategies and heuristic, provide methods to elicit this information from experts so that they can be used in the system, because they are not available to us. We don't have the black box available. And identify challenges in real world dynamic clinical environments. So what are the challenges that related, so that when we develop systems, they are useful, usable, and used in practice. So given this relationship, I'm going to talk a little bit about my work now. So in early work in my undergrad, and as I graduated in 1982, as a PhD, this area, and I had no background at that time in psychology and education. When I started as undergrad, I was a biochemist by training. So one of the people who influenced my work was Walter Kinch. And Walter Kinch was from University of Colorado, director of Cognitive Science Center. And his books on comprehension, how people comprehend information, text information, representation of meaning in memory, influenced my work greatly. He became one of my mentors early years. And so the basic idea was, the basic concept, what he developed was called propositional analysis. Proposition is one of the basic way of symbolic representation in memory. So the goal was to understand detailed semantic structure of symbolic discourse. I came up with a very much of a symbolic tradition and structure of discourse, like you have a dialogue or a diagram or a text or picture, anything. that how is it understood by somebody who reads it, looks at it, by users. Idea was that if I say a sentence, you break them into concepts. So Vimla had a red dress on. So Vimla is one concept, other one is a red dress. And there is a relationship between the two. And that stays there as a unit in memory. There's enough psychological literature to back that up as to what is in a unit of memory. What do you remember? What do you store? What do you retrieve when you need it? The important things are concept and relations are all labeled, very carefully labeled. So for example, the sentence that says a patient complained of shortness of breath, okay? So this is a proposition 1.1. The header is a complaint. It's a verb, not a noun. Chomsky showed very clearly it's a verb, and an agent is a patient here. The theme is 1.2, which is shortness of breath here. And this is the theme tense, past tense, okay? So you have the patient, shortness of breath, some degree of shortness of breath, and was complaining. This is how you unpack it. And then when he tried to climb 2 flights of stairs, try is a header. Then you have the goal is to 2.2, which is to climb the stairs. And the term is 2.6, which is in the apartment. And the stairs are in the location in the apartment. And the flights are part of the stairs. So as you can see, it's a very embedded structure, one within the other. You can unpack them. And if I ask somebody to read this text back to me to say, tell me about this patient. If they tell you something, you can actually do this kind of analysis. There was a period of time I could do pages and pages of this in my sleep, just write it down and do this kind of detailed structure in no time, because I was trained in it. And we shouldn't have to do this today. And the other one is equivalent. 1.2 is happening at the same time as 2.1. And you can do a detailed structure of bigger than, less than. You can do many kinds of structure that forms within. So you do higher level structures as well as the lower level structure, which means a syntax is built in within the semantics of this thing. Very early work of Vinograd that showed that the syntax has a meaning. So the next step was, once you got this proposition, what do? You take the propositions and you put them into a semantic relation structure. So these are the nodes which are labeled very carefully, and so are the links. These are the propositions which I just described. Now, why is this important? Because then once you form this semantics is the meaning. So if I send a whole lot of sentences, Vimla had a red dress on, Vimla went shopping, Vimla bought something else. Now, if they are disconnected, it's just pieces of utterances without any discourse, but they have to be connected. So if somebody gets this right, somebody says, oh, the patient complained of shortness of breath, there's a local coherence. Somebody gets this right, you get a local coherence. If you get all of this right, you got a global coherence. Experts have an ability to show this global coherence. And the novices are not able to do that. They get bits and pieces right, but not all of it. So the assessment of coherence, how coherence is this knowledge structure that you have in memory, very important. You're going back again to the nature of representation, okay? So there is a way to analyze this using graph theory. We use and I'm going to talk about it a little bit. Now, so I got the comprehension thing together. So I thought, wow, this is great, and I learned that. At that time, nobody was doing this kind of analysis, comprehensive analysis of adults. This work was Walter Kinch, Carl Fredrickson, one of my mentors at McGill. They all did in children's text. And they told me you can't do that in adult text. So medical text is even more complex because we don't have the provision, the kind of semantics and the syntax we need to be able to develop that. But I was going to take that challenge. So I was one of the first ones to break that text into a propositional representation and publish in this area. all right, so I got this saying, I mean, I know how doctors understand medical text. Now what? You have to use that understanding to solve the problem. The patient is here, patient's got a problem, you have to solve it, make a decision. So comprehension theories do not deal with problem solving. So my other mentor, a very influential guy in my field, Guy Gruen, who came out of Carnegie Mellon, part of his structure from Stanford to Carnegie Mellon, had worked with Newell and Simon in problem solving. And this is Herbert Simon and Alan Newell. And their work delivered comprehensive theory of problem solving, which was very influential in my work because they used the artificial intelligence, AI techniques, AI theories to develop this. So I started to think about how do I relate comprehension work and comprehension, understanding, to the notions in AI that I can borrow to be able to, a theory or framework I can develop that will relate comprehension to problem solving. This had never been done, except in mathematics. Greeno and Simon developed the theory of mathematics, how to develop a relationship between comprehension and problem solving. But it never been developed in medicine or any other area. So Guy Gruen and myself, Guy Gruen, who was my mentor, became my colleague after I graduated. So I want to show you, we published a work, the first one we developed in 1988, Relationship between Comprehension and Reasoning in Medical Expertise in 1988, and subsequently refined that in 1991. So we started to use it, and I started to use the artificial intelligence notions of what we call forward and backward chaining. The notions of chaining, how you chain information in computer science, is similar to what I use in forward and backward reasoning in medicine, except they're not exactly the same. So using that, my first published work in cognitive science was knowledge-based solution strategies in medical reasoning. This was the first one that used formal fine-grained method of propositional semantic analysis. First paper to show that knowledge and organization and relationship to medical reasoning, and that experts show they use different, and nature of expertise in reasoning shows something different than what Elstein, Schulman, Schraffer first showed. And I knew that something didn't look right in the earlier studies, but I didn't know what it was. But I challenged that earlier studies. We challenged this as a team, actually, challenged this work and said, look, this isn't exactly what's going on, that it's something, experts do something very different. And so we had a number of papers that went back and forth, including number of rebuttal in cognitive science, in memory and cognition, in Journal of Medical Decision Making, between these heavyweights, people who really were experts in the field, and myself and my colleagues to resolve what were this. And this is the nature of science. You go back and forth. I've got all those papers to show how we try to resolve. At that time, when I was using pure symbolic representation, I came under heavy criticism from people who were using embodied cognition, people who were using situated cognition, saying I'm not taking into account the environment, the situational. And they were right, but I didn't know anything about this. So I took a sabbatical and went to Stanford and worked with Jim Greeno, who understood this situated cognition, and learned what is it that I don't know. If I'm going to say and criticize something, I got to understand what it is. So I came back, and together with my colleague, at that time my student, David Kaufman, wrote a paper called Streaming Through the Murky Waters of Scientific Conflict, Symbolic versus Situated Cognition. So trying to start to bridge the work into real world to say, look, what is it that we're missing? Oh, okay, so I am having a little difficulty here. I don't know what it is, but okay, there we go. So what did we find in 1986? we studied expert cardiologists. We studied cardiology because I had a great colleague in cardiology who wanted to work with me. So I wanted to work with him. So we worked with him in detail. So we studied the expert cardiologist diagnostic explanation task. So what we asked him to do was, here's a medical problem in a text. So I want you to read the text and, summarize it, close your eyes, don't look at it, summarize the text verbally, and then try and tell me, and then explain to me and come up with a tentative explanation of what you're thinking as you're doing it. And they were thinking as you're going through to make the diagnosis. And then finally give a diagnosis. It was a diagnosis of an acute stage, and it was bacterial endocarditis. It was a cardiac problem related to a bacterial infection, which was fairly acute, it was serious. The patient had arrived in the emergency room with fever and chills and had an acute status, acute problem which needed to be attended to. Was a young man. The explanations of doctors, doctors who accurately diagnosed that, accounted for that use of a strategy called forward-directed reasoning strategies, which is very similar to forward chaining in computer science. And from data to a given problem to comprehend the diagnosis, the diagnostic components to diagnosis. Experts who misdiagnosed use a mixture of both. I want to explain that little together. Okay, let me see now. All right, so forward-directed, so this is a forward-directed reasoning, which means that you have, these are the clinical signs and symptoms the patient has. Patient arrived in the emergency room showing puncture wounds in the mark and the arm, and a transient blindness, had some findings in the urine, had fever and had chills, had a bloodshot eye, and possible drug abuse maybe, shortness of breath, had a certain murmur, and had an aortic problem with aortic insufficiency, and I had a normal spleen and had aortic valve endocarditis. That was all put together to explain that there is a drug abuse, there is a bloodshot eye, endocarditis, all this put together, it came into acute bacterial endocarditis with aortic insufficiency. Very quickly, expert decide from this sign, very quickly does some of this and moves towards that. Does not think too much about it, goes towards it, all right? So remember, the directionality goes this way, from data to very much into this way. Now, so problem solving and reasoning characterize the directionality of inference. Forward directed, it's data driven. It goes from data to hypothesis. And backward reasoning is called goal directed, which is from goal to explain the data. You have to explain the data. There's no explanation here. To explain the data, condition under which directionality changes. When do you move from one to the other? What would trigger you to explain something? An expert. And then conditions under which it triggers is ambiguity, complexity, uncertainty. These were the kinds of things that our studies showed. So forward reasoning, as I already gave you one example, another example is an unemployed young male presents with fever, rigor, and chills, and has a puncture wound mark on the arm as he arrives. The doctor says, an expert doctor, says his unemployed young male has a puncture wound mark. He says I'm employed, and says he has a cat who scratched him. Really, so he's got a cat scratch fever. And doctor thinks it's probably not, and uses his knowledge base to say he's probably an intravenous drug user, probably a contaminated needle, and most likely an infection. So data directly to infection. Okay, remember that's how they learn it at school, in the university. Now, it's a data to hypothesis. This is how you do forward chaining. When you have hypothesis-driven reasoning, when you have an example, so this particular patient is an elderly woman who presents with signs of myxedema. It's a water in the body. She also presents with respiratory failure. She had difficulty in breathing, which is not normally seen with this kind of patient. So the doctor said, well, I know what that is, but why is this person getting respiratory failure? I really don't understand it. Okay, so let me see. So probably has a metabolic state, hypometabolic state, and probably has hypoventilation, and probably explains the respiratory. So it goes on the explanatory mode. So something, anomaly, something that doesn't fit. So you get the main diagnosis correct, but some other data doesn't fit. So completely you need to explain. So inability to the uncertainty, not able to explain, ambiguity will trigger the reversal. Most often doctors go back and forth. They'll get something right, and then they'll say, okay, I don't know about this one, maybe I explain that one. Now, you got to have the underlying knowledge structure to be able to understand the explanation. If you don't have the knowledge structure right, then you can't explain this. So this is the nature of expert. Expert having a knowledge structure in such a way and stored in memory in such a way that it is retrievable when you want it. This is a very important aspect of expertise. So hypothesis to explain the data. Now, I want to explain how we used graph theory from Sowa's graph theory. Sowa was very influential in my work. And he developed this. So this is how we know what kind of breaks you make and where, as what is a global coherence and what is not. Now, this is a semantics representation of a psychiatrist trying to explain a cardiology problem. So I got a cardiologist a psychiatrist, a number of psychiatrists, in fact, to say, okay, here's a cardiology problem. And explain it like that. We are very short of cardiologists right now, and we have an urgent problem. I know you're a psychiatrist, but we need you in the cardiology unit to at least initially screen the patient a little bit and maybe explain what's going on. So the doctors took the problem, excuse me, and so this particular doctor said, looks like the patient is reacting to stress. Okay, this is a kind of tentative diagnosis, and said it results in probably because he's stressed, he's taking drugs. Remember, very unlike cardiology said. And this injection of drug that causes him to upsurge in blood pressure in the body, and therefore you get this bloodshot eye. And then it also probably causes some toxicity, which results in tachycardia, fall in blood pressure and elevated temperature. It also causes some of these. Remember, it's a causal relation. These are pretty tightly knit. Causal relationship is implication that you cannot be changed. It's a strength of implication is very strong. Condition is very simple. It's a association almost. If X, then Y. It's a rule. Very simple. It can change. Tomorrow the condition changes, the rule changes, but this doesn't change as easily. So his condition, therefore, state of shock. The psychiatrist designed that a patient's in state of shock due to stress, he took injection of drug, okay? So you can see all this relationship, how it does. This is how we analyze all the data. Now, to look for local and global coherence, I use Sowa's graph theory. I'm not going to go and explain into the graph theory, but just means that when you have a whole knowledge structure, how do you decide whether it's a local coherence or global coherence? There's certain places where your breaks can be made. One of my papers, Gruen and Patel, Comprehension and Relationship in Comprehension Problem Solving, describes this in quite great detail. Also, the second book chapter describes that great detail. How do you decide how to break it? So you can see these are causal, very difficult to break. These are condition, easy to break. It tells you that if you want to do intervention anywhere, this is not the place to intervention, causal. These are the places to intervene. Okay, just to show you how this is done, and you can count them. The qualitative information can be quantified by saying Dr. X has nine kind of local coherences out of 20, and Dr. Y had 2 kinds of local coherences out of 20. So you can actually count them and tell numbers of local coherences. Students are very good to do with students, first year, second year, third year, fourth year, as you can see how they develop over a period of time. This is what we did over development of expertise. Now, I don't want you to read through everything, just want to show you about explanation. This is, so a protocol called Think Aloud. You get the people to sit and think aloud what you're thinking. And you said the protocol, a method developed by Anders Ericsson together with Herbert Simon. You get doctors to think aloud what they're thinking about the problem. You tap that to elicit the information. Then you analyze that to be able to say, okay, what are the observations that the doctor made? And then what are the findings that he or she came up with? And then what are the final decisions in terms of a diagnostic hypothesis called facets? And what are the final diagnoses? So on. So this is a second year medical student who doesn't have much knowledge and that comes up with a diagnosis with a few things and few go backs and forth. This is a final year medical student, fourth year, has lots and lots of intermediate stages with lots of facets and comes up with multiple diagnoses, but not quite sure yet. Unlike an expert or a physician, doesn't have too many of these kind of categories, goes directly from there to there. He or she doesn't need to explain any of this, because when they're working at the point of care, extra knowledge, extra information interferes with utility. You don't want it there. But you want it there if you have problems. You want to be able to go back to it. Therefore, you need it there someplace. Systems don't have that always. Now, this has to do with epistemology of medical knowledge. Very quickly going to explain. When doctor-patient interact, there's a basic concepts. And then they have certain kinds of findings. And this is how it's related. So this is next level, because you have a kind of pyramid. If I say, I really have a problem because I think I have a family history of hypothyroidism. However, I just want to tell you, I also am not able to sleep at night and I have a very sore leg. So all the information here at the bottom level cannot be used for making a diagnosis. So they narrow it down. So basic to heuristic, intermediate construct. So when you go from final diagnosis to explain, this is the explanation. And this is going from data to hypothesis. So this is how the epistemology is very important in this particular medical reasoning and medical expertise. This is how these intermediate constructs, what you keep in memory. And therefore, you don't keep all this thing in memory. Experts keep this in memory and multiple facets. And therefore, you have a better permutation and computation and quickly able to retrieve that. When you ask an idiot savant in mathematics, what is 5,650 times 4,220? They don't go around multiplying at this level. They keep multiple forms in their heads and therefore quickly can answer that, a certain creativity. It's a very important construct to have. In fact, EHR should have that kind of construct. And so this is a very important aspect to remember, the intermediate construct. You have better permutation and computation. So when and why explanation is needed. Experts, when asked to explain or justify, use very little causal reasoning, very little explanation. They provide minimum justification consistent of data-driven forward inferences based on indicators, not causes. If patient comes in, that patient with a fever, infection, you don't say infection causes, this causes fever. I mean, the puncture wound caused this, that, to infection. The patient comes in the hospital and shows signs of fever. And signs of, and then you infer the information from it. The patient has infection. Quite the opposite. Directionality is of the opposite. The pattern changes if justification is inadequate. If they can't justify it, when they say, okay, most of it fits, but this doesn't fit. Therefore, they have to go backwards. They have to elaborate on it and explain. And this is showing signs of depth. You have to be there. Something's got to trigger that depth. If you don't have the depth of understanding, like the understanding of the beneath part of the iceberg, you're not going to be able to generate that. And that has to be easily retrievable somewhere and has to be stored in such a way they are well connected in memory. Because if they're not semantically connected, you can't retrieve it at that moment in time. Okay. Uncertainty and complexity triggers explanation. So bridging cognition to medical AI, understanding mental processes. And so these are the two papers that was, so in 1991, very early, I gave a talk at European AI in Medicine, Development of Cognitive Models of Reasoning. It's a keynote address, artificial versus real natural intelligence. Not knowing anything about systems, I didn't even know how it related. And then subsequently, that shows that fundamental theories and methods borrowed from cognition are very important even today. Understanding the social technical aspect of the environment, developing support system as part of a panel of European Artificial Intelligence Medicine in 2007, that a kind of relationship to coming of age of AI in medicine within a panel that was invited to from various perspectives. They were saying that continually evaluating, this work keeps coming back over and over again, and not to get rid of the symbolic because we are here to stay with it. Then I also at that time in 1982, we were analyzing data, machine depth within psychological depth. What we call in psychology a depth of understanding is not the same, but machine causes depth of understanding. Therefore, understanding some kind of vocabulary, very important. Understanding, bridging all that. So together with myself, with my colleague, my mentor too, Guy Gruen, Marco Romoni, a philosopher who came from Italy, who worked with me as my postdoc, David Kaufman, who was my doctoral student at that time, put this work together and analyze some of this work. Just showing that we thought about this quite early, but not knowing anything about systems much. At least I had no idea about it. In fact, I started using computer much later in my life. I didn't even know how to use it or what to do with it. So what are the messages from here? Message number one, the role of cognition in development of system, particularly artificial intelligence system. Deep learning AI systems analyze large data sets. Everybody's doing it, that's what you do from various sources. Symbolic AI deals with human-like reasoning, okay? There is a unique hybrid combination of the two, two plus the explainability, the transparency of this symbolic AI could be a valuable step in the future of AI and decision-making. It's not enough to just use large data set. Symbolic system alone, reasoning, understanding isn't going to work. There is a place for a kind of symbiosis relationship here. Because most often, people who understand this stuff don't understand that. People who understand that don't understand that. So you need that kind of relationship. Message two, a plea for science. Stay with science, you've got to have the science part of it. You cannot run with technology without the science. Science of cognition needed to drive AI-based decision support system to augment human behavior. I still think that augmenting is going to be very important. So you understand a person in his environment, in his behavior. That doesn't mean you don't have to do other parts of research, but you have to come back to augment the behavior, augment intelligence. Because there are so many hidden variables that defy the adequate consideration. Even if you leverage millions of data points, no matter how many you do, the hidden variables you're not going to understand. You need that kind of work and partnership together with a collaborative work with AI researchers, scientists, scientific researchers, and clinical communities to be able to pull this together if you are going to work in this thing. To be able to leverage. I think we can be much more powerful team if we do that. And not everybody knows everything, and we don't expect to. I mean, I have very little knowledge of the other areas, but we can partnership, we can do it. But I think bringing back that kind of some of the work is important. And this is one of my reasons for bringing it back. And my final thoughts are that the attention to cognitive issues, how we think, how we human beings make decisions, and human issues are very important. The ability to demonstrate with applications, how do you apply both utility and future promise of AI in medicine? Very important. We want to develop applications that are usable, to attend those kind of issues now, and fundamental and contribute to science. How we do it now should be able to bring it back to change the scientific foundation of saying, what is we are not attending to when we are doing laboratory-based work, or when we are doing this kind of work, because we can't understand the human beings in this natural environment. They have to be usable. So you want to be able to do that. Fundamental work in medical AI needs to be focused on impact of the discipline in the real world, not just the technical insights into gain to be by levels of computational progress. You can make a lot of computational progress, and it will happen. It will happen. But you need some fundamental medical AI, impact of discipline in the real world. What kind of? If you need to start early. The main reason being, if you don't start working now on some of these theoretical framework, able to use it, when you need to have a system ready to go, like the pandemic, you're not going to have it. So you need to start working now so that when you need systems for data analysis, pandemic, any other human, natural or man-made disasters, you don't have time to go into detail. You don't have time to explain. You don't have time to do any of it. You just want something that is quickly usable, but that has to start now, because scientific foundation takes a long time to develop. Computational progress will happen more and more. Powerful systems will be developed. So giving some thought to this, I think is very important to consider that. And with that, I should say thank you. I think I'm 2 minutes past, but thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you, Vimla, so much. That was really, really wonderful and excellent kickoff to our seminars for the year. So thank you. Do we have questions? You can raise your hand if you're on video, we can see you, or if you use the raise hand function.
I think I see Kong raising his hand.
Great, thanks.
All right. So thank you, Vimla. This is a very nice talk and very, very great. I think my question is, like you mentioned, there are a lot of hidden variables in the, deep learning or AI systems. So those variables is very difficult to explain, and we want to, make the AI system more explainable. Then I'm thinking, do you have any suggestions if we can replace those hidden variables like the facet or other findings in one of your slides mentioned, like the second-year medical students and the fourth-year medical students? If we can replace those hidden variables, that will, make it more explainable for the deep learning or AI system.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Again, this is something I have more insights into it rather than how to do things, and I wish I did. I think there is got to be a provision. First of all, the knowledge structure is very important here, because that's what you use when you explain things, and those knowledge structures have to be. And you have to make sure they are stored in a way that you can easily retrieve it when you are in the system. And these have to be stored in a particular way that are retrievable. And therefore, this is like a learning system. People should be able to learn from it. So there are systems that are performance oriented, as I gather, a little that I know about it, but systems that are learning. So you can actually explain based on it. And you have to be able to use to explain. For students' purposes, you have to be able to use that explanation system, so to fall back at the explanation mode. For example, when earlier work that Ted Shortleaf did with mycin, and subsequent work with neomycin that Bill Clancy did, was explanatory system that explained. to students. And there has got to be a lot of lessons learned, because I remember analyzing that data from explanation. The students could fall back on that explanation. But I've got to make sure that doesn't overload everything, that it interferes with the performance-oriented thing, you know? The students can fall back on it. And I think there needs to be a lot of dialogue between people who understand the systems and the person who's kind of advising it, face-to-face interacting, so they question it and answer dialogue, you know. I think this could be very beneficial to think. It should be there somewhere to be able to use if you need to, but not overtly salient, but it's like a trigger. What triggers that moment in time that you need to explain to be able to go back, you know, like almost like an info button of memory to be able to go back, you know, to be able, the students should be able to do that, so students can also learn from it. So if student says, I think the patient has hypothyroidism, but I'm not sure about this one, I need to go back, you should be able to do that. But eventually the system has to be able to perform, to deliver. So this is a trigger. Sorry, I may or may not have answered the question. I don't have much background in computer science at all, so I'm not savvy on it.
Great. I think Lisa had a question, and then we have Lena as well after that. So we'll go with Lisa first.
Thanks, Shreyas. Thanks so much for the awesome talk, Dr. Patel. It was really, really interesting. You talked about this staged approach to reasoning. I thought that was very interesting. We use a similar approach when we study patients' decision-making.
Right.
And I wondered if you could comment on the limitations of it, and especially of the Think Aloud protocol. Our concern has been that in a more kind of naturalistic environment, that this staged approach as a representation of cognition might be very incomplete. And I'm curious if you have any insights into kind of what might be missing from that approach. I'd love to hear it because it's very relevant to our own work.
Yes. So this is the other thing that we worked on also, because some people raise a concern saying, well, this is great for experts who are doctors or who are really that. What about local people? What about lay people? What about patients? So we did doctor-patient interaction and analyzed the dialogue there as well. So yes, you can do exactly the same. You can give a scenario. Take a morning newspaper, radio news that come out today about one theory about pandemic. Give a patient or patient in ICU or a lay person on the street to say, okay, now would you explain to me, what did you read just now? What did you just hear? Kind of thing. And you can analyze that. The only that you find, there are not too many causal links. They're all association, condition. There's a relationship between the theory they have about something about pandemic, or theories they have, alternative theories, and the decision they make are very loosely connected. They change tomorrow, they build tomorrow. So you can see what kind of knowledge structure they have, and what kind of prior beliefs they have about theories and fake theories or whatever they might have, and beliefs, and what are the things that are breakable, what are not. And when you start to interact with doctors, that it changes dramatically, because what happens is that most often this dialogue, patient still comes with a strong belief about something, and doctors interested in pathophysiology, and patients are interested in getting their life back to normal. And this theory, and you can actually analyze in great depth to be able to do that. And the only thing is highly unstable, the patient's knowledge structure, because tomorrow if somebody comes up with another theory, they can change. They can change rapidly. And this is why it's so difficult to actually keep patients sustained in something, you know. The idea is influence. How do you influence them to change one medication against the other? Or how do you change them not to take this or not to believe in this one? It's very hard to do that, particularly if you have a belief in it, something. But it's analyzable. We did in some of the studies, there are published studies, and to see what's needed. So understanding the patient, listening is not enough. You have to understand it, and that understanding, some kind of patient information has to be stored in the EHRs, for example, so that when you're making a decision in the real world context, you can borrow that. And the real world is also, there's a lot of social and cultural environment that will dictate it completely. There's no question about it. They will influence, but there are no differences between way we think and reason and cognitive processes, no matter which culture we come from. Culture and education feed in after the fact. So cognitive function is still fundamental. Cognitive process are exactly the same. So understanding the cognitive process are still important from a scientific point of view. I don't know if I answered your question, but that's
No, thank you. That's very interesting.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Vimla. We are right at the hour, so we will wrap up now. I'm sure Vimla's available on email if anyone has any other questions.
Welcome. Please do send me emails. I'll happy to reply to individuals anywhere. And thank you, everybody, for listening to me. Enjoy.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.